Hello. Hello. Good evening. Okay, welcome to the first annual Peace Innovators hosted by the Kroc School. How is everyone doing tonight? Ready to be inspired? Ready to be transformed? Awesome. Okay, just a little bit of feedback. We're going to be videotaping this evening, so we ask that during the presentations, you don't get up and move around. If you do need to leave at any point, you leave in between the presentations and just through these two doors here. We also ask that you stay present in this room at all times if possible, and please no flash photography because of the videotaping. Sorry. Right. I mean, if you wanted to now, right, you could. Okay. Get it out of your system. Okay, get it out of your system. I am honored and humbled to be your MC this evening. My name is Candace Price. I am an assistant professor of mathematics here at the University of San Diego. I'm delighted to be here. The Kroc School of Peace and Justice is hosting this event. It's their 10th year, so this event coincides with the 10th year here of the Kroc School. Here at the Kroc School, it is well understood that the critical issue of the 21st century will be, how do we build peace? And not just peace being the absence of conflict violence, but also how do we build communities where everyone feels safe and has an opportunity to flourish? So this evening we'll showcase some intriguing ideas and innovative thoughts by some of the faculty here at the Kroc School, where their hope is that you will be educated, that you will be transformed, that you will be inspired to build peace. We're going to start off we'll have 5 presenters this evening, faculty and project managers, program directors, program directors. They'll be presenting their work to you in a TED-style presentation, right? So I will introduce them to you and they'll come out and they'll start. We're going to start now by welcoming, please ready, Andy Blum. And Andy will be talking about the power of learning with.
I was sitting outside a police station in South Sudan. Looked a lot like this one. And I was talking to a police captain. Where we were in South Sudan, it was very violent. And sometimes small violence would become big violence. So folks had an idea. Let's find out where the small violence is and keep it from becoming big violence. The idea was to build communications centers in all 28 states of South Sudan, and people would report incidents to those communication centers. And that information would be sent to the capital in Juba so a response could be mounted. Maybe that would be the government sending troops to keep warring parties apart. Maybe the UN could send mediators to help resolve disputes. This was a big project. New buildings, generators, satellite dishes. They would send in foreign technicians on chartered airplanes to install new equipment or fix air conditioners. So I was asked by the US State Department to go to South Sudan and assess the effectiveness of the program. So I was talking to the police captain. And I asked him, what do you think of the program? He smiled and he shook his head and he said, I need 3 things. I need minutes for our cell phones, I need gasoline for our trucks, and I need a jail so when I arrest someone, I don't have to chain them to a tree. He didn't have any of these basic things. He worked next to the communication center but didn't understand how sending all that information away to the capital was going to improve things in his community. Now, as you might expect, the program in South Sudan was big, it was expensive, budget in the tens of millions of dollars. Compare that to when Jerry Sternin went to Vietnam with Save the Children. He didn't have a big budget, and he didn't have a lot of time. He was given 6 months to reduce child malnutrition in the villages he was going to work in. So he took a new approach. He went house by house to see if there were houses that had healthier babies than the others. And it turns out some did. So he went back and talked to those mothers to see what they were doing differently. And he found 2 things. The first, they were feeding their babies more often, 4 times a day instead of 2. And that allowed the babies to digest more food. The second thing he found was that the mothers were gathering greens and shrimp and crabs from the rice paddies and mixing them in with the rice, even though that kind of food wasn't considered suitable for babies. And then what he did was build a community of mothers so these practices could be shared with all the mothers in the community and the surrounding communities. And it worked. Malnutrition fell between 65 and 85% in the villages where this approach was used. Mr. Sternin was an outsider, but he knew about child development and nutrition and data collection. The mothers knew about what resources were available in their communities right here, right now. They knew about the cultural challenges you might face and how to overcome them. And together, they were able to craft a powerful solution. What these stories illustrate is a paradigm shift I believe is desperately needed if we're to address our most pressing challenges. A shift to a mindset of learning with instead of learning from. Learning with. What do you know? What do I know? How can we craft a solution together? Learning from all that information that was taken out of that South Sudanese community, and the outsiders would come back with their failed solutions. Why do we need a learning with approach if we're going to fix challenges like homelessness, improving our schools, preventing violence in our communities? It's not just because these problems are bigger or more complicated or demand more resources. It's because they're different. After all, San Francisco has more brains and money than anywhere in the world, and still we get headlines like this. Why? Because these problems that we care about are different. How are they different? When something is really difficult, we often say it's brain surgery or it's rocket science. But as difficult as these problems are, they're technical challenges. If you follow a set of steps successfully to the end, your rocket's going to get to the moon. Compare that to raising a child. Instinctively, I heard the laughter. Instinctively, we know this is a different kind of problem. There's no set of steps to get a teenager to change their behavior. You have to work with that teenager and give them new knowledge or a new perspective or instill new values. These problems are different because they involve human beings. We can call them human-centric problems. And when you set out to solve a human-centric problem, you need to engage and experiment and adapt and learn. And you need to learn with those impacted by the problem and learn with those who can contribute to a solution. Now, why do I believe this paradigm shift is so important right now? I want to be clear. It's not because we've been so bad at solving technical problems. It's because we've been so good at solving technical problems. As we solve more and more of our technical challenges, the human-centric problems stand out in sharp relief. And the more we throw technical solutions at them, the less they're going to be solved. This was Facebook's original mission statement: to make the world more connected. A hugely ambitious technical goal. And they did it. It's estimated that Facebook has 100 million servers processing 60 billion messages in 190 countries. They connected the world. This is Facebook's new mission statement. When Mark Zuckerberg announced this new mission statement, he said, "I used to think that if we connected the world and gave people a voice, that would make the world better all by itself." He went on to say that if we want to solve challenges like these, climate change, stopping violence, we need a world where people can come together to take on meaningful problems. In other words, to solve human-centric problems, we need to learn with. The thing is, once we understand the type of problem we're dealing with, we know how to learn with. Take the problem of teen smoking. For years, we have been trying to get teens to stop smoking. There was all kinds of different campaigns, public service announcements. The images that were used were powerful, visceral, like the ones you see here. They all basically boil down to the same message, though. Smoking will kill you. And they didn't work. Now, why did they not work? Think about being a teenager. Virtually the two defining characteristics of being a teenager is they think they're invincible and they don't like to be told what to do. So an organization called Truth.org came along and took a different approach. They started talking to teenagers and said, what message would resonate with you and your peers? And one message kept rising to the top. Basically, if you smoke, you're not independent, you're being controlled. The tobacco companies are playing you for a fool. Basically, you're a chump. And what teenager likes to be told that? And then they took it one step farther and built a community of teens and said, come help us solve this problem together. Think about how powerful that is. From saying you're stupid if you smoke and you're going to die, to come be part of the solution, help us. And it worked. Teen smoking fell from 35% to roughly 16% today. At the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice, we're trying to live this idea of learning with every day. The core of our mission is to work with and learn with our peacemakers here in San Diego and around the world. Just the other day, for instance, I was talking to a high school boy from Iraq. And he told us that a lot of his friends would get in trouble because the rules back home are different than the rules here. He said back home, if you got in a fight, the teachers would break it up. It was frowned upon, but it was no big deal. Here, it was an almost instant suspension. And he said some of his friends were getting suspended for the whole semester before they even figured out the rules. And that could lead them spiraling down into a lot more trouble. So we're talking with him about doing a peer-to-peer orientation for newcomers so they understand the rules from day one. And what I love about this is it's so easy to say, those newcomers, they got to learn the rules, they got to get with the program. But once you take the time to sit and listen and understand the problem, the solution almost presents itself. So this is what I want to leave you with tonight. What is that problem that you're struggling with right now? It could be in your home. It could be at work. It could be in your community, a problem you're trying to solve. What's that problem that seems to defy solutions? My guess is that problem requires learning with. What South Sudanese police captain or Vietnamese mother do you need to have a conversation with? What group of teen smokers do you need to invite over to talk to? Because solving our most difficult problems requires human connection, requires human engagement, requires learning with. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. That was phenomenal. I know I was inspired to now think more about learning with, especially in my classroom with my students. So I hope that you also were inspired in that way as well. Our next speaker is Jennifer Freeman, who will be talking about how politicians can be better followers.
In 2018, our world is dealing with nothing less than the survival of our species. Nuclear war, terrorism, poverty, violent conflict, disease. In Washington, where we would hope leaders are busy finding solutions to these global challenges, our politicians seem barely able to sit in a room together. We hear more about their bickering over a memo or an earmark or the latest case of sexual misconduct than we do about their efforts to exercise joint leadership, to reform healthcare, find common ground on gun control, or solve climate change. Sadly, the challenge isn't just in Washington. The dilemma is global. In its worst manifestations, when politicians succumb to their ego or self-interest, societies have been dragged into decades of violent conflict. In those moments, it seems that those men and women are incapable of exercising leadership. What happened to Mandela, or Lincoln, or Mother Teresa? Women and men who remind us that at moments in time, true leadership existed. Fortunately, such leaders do exist today. I know because I've spent the last 17 years learning from them. In the field of peace building, you can often find ordinary people who, when faced with overwhelming challenges, do the extraordinary. Let me tell you a story about my friend Faba and her colleague Lema. It was in the early 2000s, and Liberia was in the midst of a horrific civil war. Unthinkable violence, including the maiming and conscription of children, widespread campaigns of rape and forced abductions, were being carried out by both rebel forces and President Charles Taylor's army. Faba and Leba, unable to stand the protracted trauma the violence was wreaking, got together to form the Christian Women's Peace Initiative. Their goals were simple and desperate. They were sick and tired of the killing and raping of their children. The violence had to stop, but their leaders were part of the problem. So they began to mobilize. They started with a few women from their church, but within 2 months, they had motivated women from nearby mosques to create Muslim Women for Peace. By April 2003, just 10 months later, they'd formed Liberian Women Mass Action for Peace, which brought together groups from throughout the capital and thousands who'd been displaced from the countryside. They took the audacious risk of holding massive peaceful protests right under the nose of Charles Taylor. They kept their message united and apolitical. We, the Liberian women, are sick of the killing of our people. We want peace. No more war. Every morning, they sat in a field across from the fish market in central Monrovia, right on the main road that President Taylor passed on his way to Parliament. As attention to their protests grew, so did his threats to have them killed for embarrassing his administration. After months of growing protest, President Taylor finally agreed to meet with them. The strength of thousands of women united in their message compelled both the president and the rebel leaders to attend peace talks in nearby Ghana. To hold them accountable, the women followed them. And when the government and the warlords realized that they could continue to orchestrate the war from their cushy hotel rooms, the women brought their protest inside. They sat down on the floors outside of the doors to the negotiation rooms and blocked the men in. When the men realized and tried to force their way out, Lema evoked an old insult thought by some across West Africa to be a curse. She started to strip naked. Shocked and probably scared, the men re-entered the negotiation room and began negotiating the final peace agreement in earnest. The women of Liberia flipped the paradigm. Against a violent dictator, they took back power. They enacted leadership. For their courageous activism, Lema won the Nobel Peace Prize. Their story may seem incredible, but I have known dozens of courageous, visionary leaders, citizens who realized that when their politicians weren't exercising leadership, it was up to them. I'm so fascinated by what makes bad leaders inept, toxic, or sadistic, and good, like Faba and Lema, that I'm doing my doctorate in it. One of the key leadership theories is that leaders cannot exist without followers. Even authoritarian leaders need people following them. Their militaries, their political allies, and their citizens must comply with their control, even if it is enforced through fear. Fortunately, that isn't our reality in the same way that it was in Liberia. Without our voices telling our politicians what we need them to do, they are left in the echo chambers of Washington or Geneva, Monrovia or Moscow. Without our voices, they end up listening mainly to one another. Their leadership becomes derived more from their peers than from the people. This is the paradigm shift. How do we get our leaders to be better followers and us to be better leaders? How do we close the gap between our aspirations for our societies, our nation, and for the world, and our current reality? That gap is our leadership challenge. That gap may seem daunting, but it's not anywhere near as bad as it was, like Lema and Faba faced. At the end of the day, when we look at what opportunities we have to make sure that our politicians are listening to us 24/7, that we're the ones who are able to be their leaders and that they are listening to us, we may ask, what happened to leaders like Mandela, King, Shireen Ebadi, Wangari Maathai, Mother Teresa? People who didn't just stand up, they changed their societies, but they didn't do it alone. They harnessed people's frustrations, their hopes, their anxious agitation for change. We have forums right now that allow us to vote. We do it 100 times a day on social media. We express our likes and our dislikes, our opinions about where our country is going on Instagram and Snapchat, on Facebook and other social media. Yet when it comes to an election, we consider it incredible if we get just over half of the eligible voters out to the polls. How sad is that? Can you imagine what it would be like if we were as active politically as we are socially? But voting isn't enough. We have to think about ways in which our politicians can hear us 24/7. What can each of you walk out of here tonight and do to make your perspective known in Washington? You can vote, but exercising our leadership only once every 2 to 4 years in this country leaves a lot of time in between when our politicians are left alone in their echo chambers. So what about looking at constant communication? What does that look like when we're trying to get our politicians to listen to us? You could write an op-ed and try to influence public opinion. You could join a political party and try to change the system from within. Or, like Faba and Lema, you can start a protest. That may begin by just talking to a couple of friends, and then talking to a couple more. You never know where that could lead. Just ask Teresa Schuch, who woke up the morning after the 2016 election and typed up a Facebook post. She'd never been politically engaged, and yet through one small action, she hit on a nerve that prompted millions to join the Global Women's March. By doing something small, she prompted what's been called the largest protest movement in US history, that had 4 million people marching in the US and over 130 marches worldwide. Which brings us back to the power of social media. For those of us who are change makers, looking to have our politicians listen to us 24/7, there's an app for that. It's called Countable, and it's a nonpartisan platform that allows everybody to read clear and succinct summaries of upcoming and active legislation. It allows us to vote, yay or nay, and directly tell our lawmakers how we want them to vote on these bills. Not everybody can drop everything and organize a protest. Not everybody wants to be a politician, and not everybody can get a piece published in the New York Times. But everybody can tap a screen. If we're going to be ranting to our friends on social media, we have no excuse not to be telling our politicians what we want them to be doing on an app. An issue that makes this real for me is school shootings. My husband and I both work at universities. We have a daughter in 3rd grade and a son in kindergarten. Since Sandy Hook, there have been more mornings than I care to remember when I've wondered if maybe today was the day that we shouldn't take them to school. There were mothers whose children went to Stoneman Douglas High School who support the Second Amendment, and fathers there who believe that AR-15s should be banned. But what they can both agree upon is that nobody wants to see their children gunned down in a classroom. So while we may have very different ideas of how that can be prevented, the only way our politicians are going to be able to develop effective policies is if they actually talk to the other side. It seems fitting that right now, it is the students who are stepping up to this challenge. After decades of partisan politics, they are telling our politicians, we're tired of your BS. If you're not going to lead on this issue, we are. We're at a moment in history. In many ways, in our hyper-connected age, we're becoming more divided than ever before. But what I want to leave you with tonight is that it would be futile to wait for a leader out there to save us from our current dysfunction. We are the ones who put our political representatives in power. They represent us. So now, perhaps more than at any other time, we are the ones we've been waiting for. Our political, social, and environmental destiny is in our hands. We have the duty and right to self-determination. It is ours to lead. Thank you.
Wow. I think very inspired to be a leader, especially for politicians that we currently have. It seems that they might be searching for that, right? Searching for a little bit of leadership. Just gonna put that out there. Very inspired. I just remember that one quote, if I am to die, right? Let them know that I died. If I were to be killed, let them know that I was killed fighting for peace. Wow. Right? Okay. Our next speaker is Ev Meade, and he'll be talking about how we can be anchors and not parachutes.
Sinaloa. The word itself conjures fear and mystery. The headquarters of the world's most powerful drug cartel, the land of El Chapo, where demonstrators protested his arrest and celebrated his escapes, where buchonas, scantily clad women, wear "Give me a baby, Chapo" t-shirts and blur the lines between real life and music videos, where tigers and jaguars are pets, where gangsters' grave sites have air conditioning, Wi-Fi, and original art on the walls, where ordinary people spend the half hour after New Year's hiding under tables as automatic gunfire erupts across the Capitol, where more than 90% of homicides do not produce an arrest. So what can a gringo professor and some graduate students do in a place like this? How can we help to reduce violence and build sustainable peace? What can universities do more broadly in places that are beset by violence and shrouded in fear? What can you do, informed citizens? Quite a bit, I think. And the trick is to make yourself into an anchor, not a parachute. The first step in this process is to unpack the mythos of a place like Sinaloa. There's a popular narco corrido in Mexico right now called Por Ser de Sinaloa, just for being from Sinaloa. The singer bemoans the harassment he gets at the hands of the police and potential mothers-in-law and respectable people everywhere, even as he dresses and acts just like a drug trafficker. And it's not just a winking metaphor. Right now, the State Department gives Sinaloa its most severe advisory: do not travel, and marks it a glaring red on its alert map. It's true, violence has spiked recently, and in fact, Sinaloa is the epicenter of a decade-long wave of violence in Mexico that's cost more than 150,000 lives, more than 30,000 forced disappearances, and the assassination of hundreds of activists and journalists. It's real. And sometimes the work of peace building means that you have to go to places and engage with people in situations where conventional educators might not venture. But we're not like police or firefighters or Marines either, running into danger. And we shouldn't think of ourselves that way. That kind of ethos lends itself to the shortcuts we take in times of crisis. Right? During a fire, we're worried about how many lives we can save. We're not worried about the long-term effects of our actions or the root causes or whether or not we strengthen democracy. It's an exercise of power, no? We become like soldiers in a war, parachuting into danger. And when we parachute into places like Sinaloa, we do more harm than good. Examples of this abound. As proof of success in Sinaloa, the first U.S. drug czar cited the economic devastation of the countryside. That devastation actually increased the reputation of local drug cartels. Why? Because they were the only ones who came in afterwards and rebuilt devastated towns. Can we really blame people for supporting them? How are those people supposed to live? More recently, USAID has a program called the Culture of Lawfulness, where they promote a civic values curriculum. Most would agree that taking bribes or disrespecting the legal authorities are bad things, no doubt. But how can you ask the mother of a person kidnapped and disappeared by men in police uniforms or police vehicles to respect the police, to trust the police? They have to lead by example, and those same officers can't set a good example if their own families are threatened by organized crime and their government cannot protect them. In 2007, Mexican President Felipe Calderón talked about innocent victims of torture, murder, and disappearance as collateral damage of the drug war. People might accept collateral damage in a short-term conflict or crisis. But the present drug war in Mexico has raged on for more than a decade, and there's no end in sight. And it's not just high government officials or heavy-handed actions with soldiers, guns, and money. This top-down tendency of the parachutist has been replicated and internalized and vocalized locally. So, for example, when we ask participants in our programs in Mexico, what's the most important cause of violence? The most popular answer is the, quote, ignorance of the people. And it's often accompanied by colorful local examples. So they cite a case known as El Pirata de Culiacán. El Pirata was a chubby teenage YouTube star who acted and partied like a drug trafficker and then got murdered for insulting a real drug trafficker just last December. El Pirata embodies a stereotype about a whole class of people in Sinaloa who would trade their daughters for a new pickup truck. And what solution do the offended propose? Education and courses in values are the most popular. If your plan is to parachute in from on high and lecture people with little regard for the long-term consequences or root causes, it doesn't matter if you're coming from Mexico City or Washington, D.C., or San Diego, or the State House, or the private school around the corner, or up on the hill, as it might be. We have to do better. So you might say to me, and lots of people say this to me all the time, and they say it very conversationally, right? You might say to me, yeah, but just legalize it. Legalize it, bro. I hear it all the time. Look, the criminalization of drugs is clearly responsible for a lot of the violence, and decriminalization could play a role in reducing it. But as a one-off solution, It's just another parachute. It's an abstraction dropped into a dangerous place from a safe distance. It's a nice end with no clear means. More important, decriminalization doesn't deal with the fact that much of the violence of the drug war in Mexico is actually political violence. Nor can it deal with the crushing reality of drug addiction in the United States, but increasingly in Mexico as well. Most important, decriminalization can't undo the harm already done. Dealing with this harm, with the human side of the drug war, isn't just a palliative. It's a precondition for any kind of meaningful social change. So how do you make yourself into an anchor rather than a parachute? How do you make yourself into a source of strength in turbulent times? Strength from afar that locals can leverage. Well, here at the Kroc School, our model is simple. We offer free or low-cost peacebuilding programs to people in affected areas, like Sinaloa, and we use them for two purposes. First, as incubators for local social innovations, and second, as a teaching lab for our own students. And there's no false idealism here either. And we're not just using other people's pain or distress as teachable material. We serve each other's interests. We offer ourselves as intellectual infrastructure, free from local political commitments and institutional constraints. And our local partners offer our students a seat at the table, the chance to apply their knowledge in the messy but beautiful world beyond the classroom. So you might ask me, well, what do we teach? How do you do it? Well, we specialize in preventing, mitigating, and dealing with the aftermath of armed conflict. So we begin with some basic lessons about armed conflict. Let me share 3 of those lessons with you. The first lesson is that most of the killing, even during war, is done by a small minority of people. From World War II to the genocides in Cambodia and Rwanda, whole populations mobilized to fight, but tiny minorities were responsible for most of the killing. The second lesson, most atrocities involve coercive participation, and most of the perpetrators are young people. And this holds true whether we're talking about Vietnam or Guatemala or Tamaulipas or Michoacan. The third lesson, most people become physically ill the first time they kill someone or the first time they witness a killing. And even those who seem to take sadistic pleasure in killing or being around killing retain the possibility to recognize and suffer morally for what they have done. And crucially, most of them have been victims of violence themselves. These basic facts about armed conflict remind us that we're facing a violence problem, not a Sinaloa problem or a Mexico problem. They also remind us that it's a shared problem and that we should and must share the burdens of this experience. Trauma and violence isolate by definition. They rupture survivors' self-narratives and leave them feeling like nobody could possibly understand their pain. But violence also creates stories that need to be told. And the universality of these stories means that veterans of Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan have something to say to veterans of Guerrero and Sinaloa and Michoacan. That solidarity is possible and, in fact, necessary. And if you want to make this connection, you have to engage with perpetrators. They're people, not zombies, after all. You know, the zombie craze in pop culture and The Walking Dead and all that, it's just as popular in Mexico as it is in the United States. In fact, The Walking Dead is shot in Mexico. And it offers a perfect inversion of the real violence we face in Mexico right now. In the middle of a conflict in which the line between victims and perpetrators is murky and morally complex, zombies imagine violence with no moral ambiguity, victims with no personality, and killing as a kind of sport where you get style points for creative methods. When we ditch the zombies and we deal with perpetrators as people, the results can be really surprising. Let me tell you a little story. One of the participants, a graduate student in one of our seminars in Culiacan, Sinaloa, related to us an encounter that he had with 3 sicarios, killers. He and 2 colleagues were scouting locations to build new schools when they blew a tire along a remote stretch of road in northern Sinaloa. He walked to a gas station to get a wrench, only to realize when he got back to the truck that he had the wrong size wrench. Just as the sun was starting to set, an SUV with 3 armed dudes rolled up behind them. 2 of the guys got out. Petrified, the graduate student explained to them what had happened, and they went and got the right-sized wrench out of their truck and helped them change the tire. Afterwards, the grad student sitting in the driver's side, and the boss of the armed band comes up to the window. He thinks to himself, I hope they just take the truck. Instead, the guy offers his hand, and he leaves them with a kind of request. He says, listen, morros, listen, guys, bring some schools up here to the rancho. I know that we're screwed, but I want the kids around here to learn a different way to make a living. They shook hands, and he left. This was an invitation to build bridges, not walls. And as peace builders, there are 3 core principles that guide building bridges. The first is recognition. We have to actively accompany, document, and recognize the experience of victims and survivors, but also of perpetrators and witnesses as people, as human beings, not as data points or problems. Second, we have to provide them with positive support. Sure, we want to teach them all kinds of high-order stuff about peace building, but we also have to teach people tangible skills, alternative ways of living. Things like, how do you make craft beer, start a craft beer movement? How do you do market research or survey? Something as simple as, how do you shoot a documentary film on your phone and share it? And we have to give them the space to design and prototype and implement their own ideas, not our ideas. The third principle is integration. Culiacan, like much of urban Latin America, is a city of walls and gates and security guards, of segregated and inaccessible public spaces. And beyond the physical barriers, institutional and social hierarchies channel people into silos and discourage collaboration. But it's also a place of tremendous resources. The best part about this work is that you discover the incredible civic activism and civic spirit below the headlines. Things like pioneering after-school programs, former graffiti artists who've totally revamped public spaces, caravans of ordinary citizens who've retaken and revitalized the beach at Altata, and now the plaza at Villa Juarez, places that have been totally overrun by drugs and blight, marketing professionals who donate their time doing media campaigns for peace. We need to build bridges with these people. And we need to tear down the walls that separate the resources that they represent from the people who need them the most. Building bridges and tearing down walls isn't just a nice metaphor for the US-Mexico border either. You might ask me, why aren't we doing this in New Orleans or Baltimore or Chicago? Let's think about Chicago for a second. In 2013, the Chicago Crime Commission named El Chapo Guzman, the same dude from Sinaloa, public enemy number 1, a designation it hadn't used since Al Capone in 1929. And like Sinaloa, Chicago has a problem with violence, but it also has a disproportionately bad reputation. Chicago actually is not in the top 5 homicide rates in the United States right now. More important, the best activists in Chicago know the lessons of war. They know that most of the perpetrators are young people seeking a justice that they can't get from the authorities. They're not zombies. And they know that they're redeemable with recognition, with positive support, and with integration. How cool would it be to link them with activists from Sinaloa? Why can't universities be that bridge? We have the intellectual capital. We have the social networks to anchor this kind of effort, including you fine people. And we need to train our students to apply their knowledge in the real world. You want to be a peace builder? You want to make a difference in a place like Sinaloa? Seek out those common threads, those stories that need to be told, those interests waiting to be addressed. Make yourself an anchor, a resource, and leave your parachute behind.
Thank you, Ev. That's amazing. I'm really going to start reflecting on where in my life I'm an anchor and where in my life I'm a parachute. Right. Our next speaker is Patricia Marquez, and she'll be talking to us about peace at the university.
"113 years ago, in 1895, Charles Eliot, the president of Harvard University, read an article written by alum George Layton. Layton had a problem. He was the president of the Los Angeles Terminal Railway, and he was urging Harvard to create a program to train railroad officials, described by him as not only men of affairs, but lawyer, financier, engineer, accountant, economist. This is the end of the 19th century, an era of economic growth, where the railways and the telegraphs connected people and resources across the vast territories of the United States. From his work in railways, Layton understood the great opportunity ahead. But he also understood the complications, the many decisions to be made regarding where to build lines, rates in traffic, workers and supervisors, decisions that require specific skills and knowledge. Even though he didn't know it at the time, what Layton really wanted was well-trained MBAs. 13 years later, at the founding of the Harvard Business School in 1908, there were only a handful of schools of business around the world. Harvard had to invent everything: curriculum, courses, reading materials, cases. It even had to figure out where to find business professors. His founding dean was a historian. Business was not considered an academic field, and building business education would take time and perseverance. As the founding dean wrote in a letter, he was constantly being told, business cannot be taught. The creation of business education conveys a great response by the university to an important demand of the 20th century. Train managers to lead complex industrial organizations. Their impact in society is undeniable. Of course, today, we have schools of business everywhere. More than 100 years later, I say society requires professionals with greater training in conflict resolution and transformation, social innovation, and community building. We need professionals to build peace. We need professionals to build peace. By mid-century, it's said that the population will reach 10 billion people. Estimates say that 70% of those 10 billion people will live in cities. Whether we like it or not, cities are our future. Our reality is one of increasing diversity, density, and complete connectivity. And our reality and our challenge is one of how do we build peaceful coexistence. With a population of this size, we're all neighbors. Whether we are on the airplane, down the hall, down the road, or across the ocean. And we all know that neighbors can be wonderful, but they can also drive you crazy. New York City is home to a population of 8.5 million people, with almost 200 languages spoken, and 40% of its population born outside the United States. New York City is a model to the world, with incredible diversity in food and cultural opportunity, people. But this great city faces an array of ongoing pressures that need to be managed on a daily basis. This shows in small and large ways. For example, very Orthodox Jews have sought to restrict traffic in their neighborhoods out of respect for their religious strictures. African Americans are understandably conflicted about the gentrification of Harlem, the historical black part of the city. This city, all cities, small and large adjustments and negotiation happen every day. Diversity intersects with density to add layers of complexity to our challenge of peaceful coexistence. Imagine what everyday life is like in a slum like Kibera in Nairobi, with estimates of 1 million people living in an area the size of 3/4 Central Park. Mexico City is a wonderful place with great history and cultural richness. But with a population over 21 million people, try to imagine the challenge of providing basic services: road repair, power, water. And just to keep things working, this city even requires sewage divers. Cape Town is considered to be one of the most beautiful cities in this world, with 1.8 visitors per year. Today, however, Cape Town faces imminent day zero, today where there will be no potable water for its residents and visitors. But whatever we're going to be facing in this century, we are going to experience this together because of our global connectivity. 70% of the population owns a mobile phone. This type of connectivity creates incredible opportunities, like helping the poor stay connected and do all kinds of transactions that were impossible not that long ago. At the same time, when the wrong button is hit, and it says something like ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii, seeking median shelter, this is not a drill. It can appear instantly in millions of cell phones, causing panic among locals and tourists alike. Our challenge of peaceful coexistence is not simply a matter of more people crowded in cities. The large numbers of people displaced across the globe is a tragic example of our challenge. 66 million people, nearly 1 person in 100, have been forced to move away from their homes. Imagine how bad the situation would have to become for you to move away from your home, to leave everything that you know and love. Baglar Kabalo wrote the story of Ahmed, a 67-year-old man from Syria who left with his family. Tunisian smugglers were to transport them from Libya to Malta. While in Libya, they fell in the hands of human traffickers who subjected them to all kinds of abuse. Eventually, they managed to board a boat together with 200 other passengers seeking escape. While at sea, militiamen joined them, demanding bribes which proved impossible for the impoverished migrants. Enraged gunmen started to shoot immediately, injuring and killing people and causing the boat to sink. Ahmed survived, but he lost 8 family members. Instead of a better life, Ahmed ended up in a refugee camp in Malta with no will to live. The search for a better life is a global quest. This migrant crisis is like the canary in the coal mines, warning us that if we cannot build peaceful coexistence, we might be shaping a more volatile and violent reality for all. It also highlights that our challenge is not an easy one. Building peaceful coexistence is complex and paradoxical. In an increasingly diverse, dense, and connected world, the question for us is how to build peaceful coexistence where the rights of all individuals are being met. I contend this will not happen without intention and education. I am not speaking just to train people to contain violence, but developing professionals who can build peaceful coexistence where every individual has the opportunity to thrive, to feel safe and included. That is what we do at the Kroc School. We teach methods and strategies to build peace. If we compare post-hurricane Puerto Rico versus Houston, it is clear that Houston had greater capacity to plan for and react to a hurricane. It had greater resilience to bounce back from a hurricane. Resilience involving the combination of people, processes, and institutions to bounce back from a crisis. Resilience involves relationships. It involves trusting others and in certain levels of functionality. We teach professionals who go into communities to build resilience. We teach skills and knowledge to transform crisis, to transform conflict, and to design new solutions to social problems. We focus on innovation. We all know the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over and over and expect different results. Innovation emerges in the combination of disciplines. In a course in peace engineering, a student designing a drone works alongside a student activist seeking to find ways to deactivate landmines effectively. The innovator mindset is further developed through experimentation. As part of coursework, students must roll up their sleeve, get out of the building, and test their innovations for change. We take the world as real-life learning space. The Kroc School has a network of more than 1,000 women who are building peace in communities around the world. Yamandao is one of them. She's a police officer from the Gambia working on the protection of women and children. In San Diego, Yamandao shares with students, faculty, and community members what it means to be a courageous doer. Building peace is no easy work, and Yamandao is one tough cookie. In Darfur, she was shot 3 times in her leg, and when her wounds festered, she used her own knife to address the situation. In late spring, students and researchers will go to the Gambia to see Yamandao's work in action and to export their own local knowledge. The Kroc School It's part of university. We capture what we learn on how to build peace, and we share new knowledge outside the ivory tower. We are committed to finding ways to share knowledge faster. The world cannot wait. If we don't speak now, charlatans might become the strong voice. We believe education is our most powerful tool to transform systems, to change the order of things for the better. The Harvard Business School founding dean proved skeptics wrong. It turns out business can be taught. And teaching business has generated great wealth and prosperity. I know peace can be taught. It can, and it should be taught. This is the time to train professionals who can shape communities, diverse, dense, and connected communities with justice and inclusion. The Kroc School is an early innovator in peace education. My hope is that in the next 113 years, the Kroc School will be one among hundreds of thousands of global institutions graduating professionals of peace, creating a more just and humane world. Thank you.
Fantastic. I know I'm pretty fired up now to support the Kroc School. Who else? Yeah, that was great. That was great. We are now to our last speaker of the evening. Okay, it's been a great evening so far. I'm truly inspired by all of the speakers. This last speaker that we'll have is Choi-Fitzpatrick, and he will be talking about why drones need better angels.
I'm a scholar of social movements and social change. I care about questions like, how do old ideas go away and get replaced by new ones? How do the powerful lose control? How do new technologies alter the balance of power in favor of the people? So maybe that's why my story tonight starts on the streets in the middle of a protest in Budapest. I was living there as a faculty member at a university focused on how open societies can make the world a better place. By open societies, I mean vibrant and tolerant democracies whose governments are accountable to the people. That's what I care about, empowered people and accountable authorities. So I was at this event as a social movement scholar, as an observer, but I was also there as a participant. People had turned out, we had all turned out, in order to protest a new tax policy that the Hungarian government had proposed, $1 per gigabyte for everyone. And this was something that hurt the young and the old, it hurt anarchists and capitalists, it hurt the rich and the poor and individuals and businesses. It hurt everybody, and everybody had turned out onto the streets. Now in Budapest, protests are usually small affairs. There's lots of worthy causes, but not the sort of turnout that you'd expect to get the government's attention. I know this because at the time, I was running an innovative human rights lab focused on using new technology to estimate the size of crowds. Now, how many people turn out at events is important. If nobody turns out at an event, it's likely that the event or the person or the policy in question just doesn't have broad support. So an important question, though, is if turnout matters, how many people turn out? I'm curious about this. I'm a social movement scholar. So I started a human rights lab, and our job was to figure out how many people show up at events. We did this using a new technology. We did this using drones. Not a fancy drone, not a predator drone, a basic drone. The kind that packs the brains of a smartphone and the stability of a helicopter into like the price point of a laptop. Over the last 5 years, these have exploded in popularity. So if you've seen one somewhere and have been annoyed by one somewhere, it was something like this. This is what we use in Budapest. This same platform with our research there. Here, my students build drones like this over a series of afternoons for about $200 in parts that we order online. So this is the general type of platform that we were using to document the size of crowds. Now, in Budapest, up until the protest I'm telling you about right now, all of the events we'd been to were small. A few dozen people here, a few hundred there. Lots of worthy causes, but not a lot of turnout. So it was late one night when I got a call from local activists, because I like to think I'm on their speed dial. They called me. They said there's going to be a protest and it's going to be huge. So I grabbed the drone, I grabbed my top graduate student, and we swung into action. And right away, we emerged from the subway and into the kind of energy and enthusiasm that we've all experienced in crowds of like-minded people. Whether it's music or sports, whether it's concerts or political events, there's a solidarity that's thrilling when we get together with crowds and groups of like-minded people. The protests are no different. There's a solidarity that's thrilling, even in protests, maybe especially in protests. So since I'd been to so many other protests, I scanned the crowd and I could see familiar faces. The familiar faces were there from other events, but they were faces in the crowd. They were individuals and a mass of folks. It looked like everybody had turned out. Now, the next day, the government responded. They said the turnout was small, and they said they checked and saw it was the same old cranks and anarchists, and they were at it again. But they were wrong. And we could prove it. We could prove it because we had been using this device to capture footage, right? And what our footage demonstrated was hundreds of people in crowds of thousands and tens of thousands, hundreds of people holding their phones up. These are the devices the government was proposing taxing, right? Holding their phones up in an act of solidarity and resistance toward the drone, right? I'm old enough, some of you are old enough, you may remember the analog version of this. Same thing, same thing. So these lit phones told the government, actually told the world, what people on the street already knew. It wasn't cranks and anarchists. It was everyone. Now, when it comes to estimating crowd sizes, governments do what the Hungarian government did. They lowball. And social movements do what social movements do. They say everybody turned out. They aim for the stars. But the truth is usually somewhere in the middle. And the truth matters. And here's why. New social science has demonstrated that when about 5% of a population turns out in nonviolent protest, the people win. So we ran with this footage back to the lab, we crunched the numbers, and about 4.5% of the population had turned out. So about a week later, the government dropped the tax policy, the movement declared a victory, and I think the world was a better place. So I'm telling you this story for two reasons. The first is that drones can help us see the world from a new perspective. And the second is that drones can help hold the powerful to account. Now, holding the powerful to account, I like the sound of that. I'm a social movement scholar. Holding the powerful to account sounds promising, but with new technology, there's also significant peril. The French philosopher Paul Virilio once said that inside every invention is its accident. He said the invention of the automobile is actually also the invention of the car crash. We can think of the internet, right? Which is an amazing thing. We've gone in 3 short decades from the information superhighway. I remember this, some of you do, the information superhighway, and here we are now with the dark web, where you can trade in guns, weapons, and people with impunity. The internet was sold as having boundless promise, and in a lot of ways, it has way more promise than we ever anticipated. Virtually all of us right now have in this room, in our pockets, a mobile banking platform, easy management of our money, maps for easy location services, social spaces for sharing our lives, and critical cat videos with others. Boundless promise. But the internet's also facilitated the access that creeps and criminals have to our lives and our data, right? So for every bank, there's a hacked account, and for every map, there's your tracked location. And For every social media space, there's a hijacked political debate. Drones are having the same moment. Drones increase the tools that creeps and criminals have to spy and to steal. Drones increase the tools that the powerful, or anyone really, has to violate rights, violate our privacy. All over this country, actually all over the world, the police are scrambling to buy drones that could have followed you here to this event if you'd run a red light. So is that how drones are getting used? We have two competing hypotheses here, right? Is it they're empowering people or they're invading our privacy? I don't know the answer, so we went back to the lab and tried to sort this out. We gathered a bunch of data on drone use ever since these smaller drones have been available. We looked at 15,000 cases of drone use, 15,000 cases. We just said, well, what are people doing with them? And this is what people are doing. Lots and lots of pro-social things. Search and rescue, science, innovation, new businesses. The thing that surprised me was the two trends that were the smallest to see, the hardest to find, and I had to put an arrow up there so you could see them. That's the use of drones for spying, for surveillance, and for crime. Antisocial uses are the smallest bits of data we could find in this worldwide survey covering 6 years. So I'm arguing that new technology increases the tools that people have to do things people do, increases the tools criminals have to do crime. Most of us aren't criminals. So it turns out that this technology, like all technologies, also increases our ability to care for others. We can imagine flying defibrillators. You can press a button and one can find you and help save your life. Anti-poaching drones, which increase the capacity, scale, and scope of conservationists in protecting endangered species. Or the use of drones as in our work on estimating crowd size to help hold the powerful to account, amplify the voice of the people, make the world a better place. So what are some of the implications here? One of the implications, and one of the things we need to start wrestling with and thinking about, is that drones allow us to hack space. With the internet, one of the things that we got so excited about was its ability to allow us to hack the world of data in bits and bytes. But with drones, and here's the really crazy thing, with drones, the hacking is of the space we're in. Drones hack the world of atoms. Drones and other robots are perhaps the next species of the internet when it emerges from the cloud and onto dry land for the first time. Maybe it does so in the form of our own devices. Drones and other robots are perhaps the next species of the internet, or of algorithms, or of artificial intelligence. So what does this mean? I mean, for us, what does this mean? Well, for starters, it means we have new things in the sky. Where will these things fly? Not my drone, my one drone, or my team's, or my students' half-dozen drones, but 1 million delivery drones. Will they block our sunsets? Will they fly over our backyards? We don't have language or metaphor for these things. We need new metaphors. We need to start imagining things like solid flows of traffic, solid streams of traffic in coordinated flows, or murmurs of starlings in coordinated flight. These are the sorts of new metaphors we're going to need to wrestle with in thinking about having new stuff in our sky. But where will they fly? Over our backyards? Will they block our sunsets? Will they have sensors and cameras? Where will that data go? Drones also mean new things for the ground. Walls, terrace gardens, backyards, penthouses were all designed with a horizontal view in mind. But drones upend centuries of theory and practice in architecture, urban planning, artistic expression. Graffiti is something that as a species we've been doing for millennia. And our graffiti for all that time has been on walls that we can reach and see. But what happened to our graffiti when we can reach and see new places? Graffiti drones aren't limited by the length of our arms. And graffiti drones aren't limited by the height of our ladders. Now, clearly, we're in the very beginning of this as an art form. But let that sink in. Drone graffiti is in its early stages as an art form. Drones also mean new things for our laws. Not only laws about safety and privacy, but also basic enforcement, basic accountability. Our laws are organized around systems of accountability that drones evade and confound by design. Remember, my students build drones without anyone's knowledge or permission. They could, if they wanted to, fly them beyond anybody's control with no accountability. So drones mean new things for the air, for the ground. They mean new things for our laws. They also challenge what we think of as normal. We're going to need to develop new ideas about what's normal in order to cope with the future. If regulation is hard, we need new norms. Most people, want to be accepted. We find ways of either developing or adopting or adhering to new social norms. So what sort of new normal do we want to create in this world? What sort of values will we ask our laws to enforce? What sort of people will we assume users to be? These are tricky questions, and they're going to need to get answered. So what do we do when new technology has promise and peril? And what do we do when new technology makes old laws hard to enforce? Well, the first thing we're going to need is new laws. And I'd like to argue to you all that those new laws have to take into account the values of open society. They have to take seriously the better angels of our natures as human beings. And the reason for this is that governments and corporations can't be the only actors at the table when we negotiate the new rules and new laws that will govern this new world. People, we the people, residents and citizens, we must be at the table to ensure that new laws respect the greater good, that they're built to empower people. They're built in ways that can also hold authorities to account. We will need new laws. But in a lot of ways, this technology pushes the puzzle beyond the realm of laws and into an additional realm. The sort of massive coordinated flows of drones that I'm describing earlier, a sort of architecture and arteries of infrastructural flying objects, managing those sorts of flows and avoiding collision will not be possible with individual humans or groups of humans or institutions. We're going to need help. And for help, we're going to turn to artificial intelligence. So while I'm saying to you that our laws should look to the better angels of our natures as human beings and embed the values of open society, a really great question, I think, is, does artificial intelligence have a better angel of its nature? That's a challenge for us, because after all, at the end of the day, we're going to be the ones programming the machines, we're going to be the ones programming the algorithms, we're going to be the ones programming the artificial intelligence. So the challenge is for us, at the end of the day, as we embark in a new era, can we program into these systems our better selves and our better angels? Thank you.
Amazing. So I had the opportunity to take some notes, right? And so the promise and peril of new technology, right? Sort of what I'm taking away from that. Peace at the university level, right? From the talk right before. How can we be anchors and not parachutes? How am I going to be a better leader for politicians to follow? And how am I going to learn with? I want to thank all of you for coming I hope that you are also, just as I am, inspired by all of these presentations, inspired to create and build a community of peace. I think the dream of the organizers of this event is to build a movement around voices raising awareness of issues that are about poverty, justice, peace, and also issues of solutions. This is hopefully the first of many of these events, an event where you will hear the voices of fearless academics, the voices of courageous doers, voices seeking knowledge on how to shape a better world, a world built on peace. Thank you.